Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Also, thank you very much, Roman, for your presentation. I'd like to bring you two together. From what I know, it's the first time you've been in an event together, right? So before we open up for Q&A, which I invite our Zoom audience and our audiences in YouTube and Vimeo to write their questions on chats, and we will try to address as much as we can later on. So before we do that, I would just like to give you both some time maybe to ask questions or to comment each other's researches, works, and presentations too. And
I definitely have questions for Carolina.
Please be my guest.
Well, that was really wonderful and very inspiring, Carolina. And, you know, it brought back a lot of memories for me in a funny way, because back in the 1990s, I spent a lot of time in Guatemala working with refugee communities, with indigenous Mayan refugees towards the end of Guatemala's civil war. And some of your film clips there were reminding me of, you know, the way that in indigenous Mayan communities, Quiche people, they talk about themselves as hombres de maíz, you know, the people of the corn. And I remember when I was there living in those communities in the Ishkan jungle, just not for very long, for some time, I thought, I'm never going to forget this experience, this sense of connection that they have to the land and also to their different sense of time, slow time. I thought, I'm never going to rush again. Well, then I go back to, you know, living back in London as I was at the time. And, you know, the first day I'm back, I'm thinking, I'm not going to worry that the train is going to be late or anything. I'm going to just, you know, be slow, take that Mayan cosmovision. But within a couple of weeks, it kind of gone in many ways. And in there, I think, is a kind of a question really about how do we learn in a kind of visceral way that we can touch and feel still in our bodies that and learn from those indigenous encounters or indigenous knowledge. And, you know, how do I feel? I'd love to feel that my anus was tied, you know, when I see a dam, but I don't feel that. So how does this knowledge be transmitted across cultures? What have you learned about that in your work around being damned and other works?
Well, I think, you know, as artists who have the skills to construct images, but also deconstruct images, you know, we have the power of creating that counter narratives, those visual counter narratives, and to bring to the forefront the visual spells, you know, that can break the authoritarian spell we are in at the moment. You know, because coming back to that rhythm is just like being back in that authoritarian spell, right? We have to have a lot of strength, and we have to, you know, mention it, bring to the forefront with our stories as storytellers, as image makers, not only the visual impacts, but also the emotional impacts. You know, once we can relate on an emotional level with the communities who are on the front lines, I think that's when we can start processing and taking better decisions ourselves in, you know, in the global north or in the Western Eurocentric practices. I think also that, you know, just understanding also that infrastructure is not something that exists outside of us, that is something like a dam that's kind of out there somewhere in the rural, but that there's infrastructure within us, even at, you know, very, you know, in our own bodies, and to start looking to that immediacy of our own context and, you know, our own lives. For example, for me, something that really grounded it and nailed it down as a woman was that I understood that there were several dams, you know, some of them self-imposed, for example, being silent against any injustice that I was witnessing and not speaking up was one of the first dams we self-imposed, all of us. So being able to recover, you know, that possibility of speaking up and being a support system for people in the front lines and supporting agendas in the front lines. But even something more intimate that I'm going to share with you is that, you know, as part of that process of looking what are the dams in my everyday, I understood that my IUD, my intrauterine device, was serving as a dam, you know, and not to, and I don't bring this to start a conversation to be judgmental about women who have it, or or the different processes that have allowed for us women historically this kind of mechanism. But understand that this was definitely something designed by a man, implanted in me by a man, and it was time to take it out and to regain the power of my own sexual health, and to know my own cycles of when I was fertile and not be depending on this. So it has to do also with unlearning. To learn, we have to unlearn. Yeah.
This idea of infrastructure, both within us and outside, reminds me. I think it's beautiful the parallel you described, Carolina, between the dam as being a corporate-made, impenetrable, and unmovable infrastructure that cuts the natural flow of an ecosystem, versus the fishnet as being something still man-made, but that provides sustenance within limits, right? And then I was thinking about the two key concepts that anchor the Good Ancestor that Roman wrote, which are the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain. So, Roman, you can elaborate much better than I can, but the marshmallow would seek short-term satisfaction and pleasure, whereas the acorn brain has a more foresees the future, right? And I think they're really useful as images, both the dam and the net and the acorn brain and the marshmallow brain, to show like not only the tug of war between long-termism and short-termism, but also the tug of war between the connection to place that you were mentioning in your keynote, Roman. And not only the connection to place, but the connection with yourself, others, and others, more than human others. If I can turn this into a question, and maybe having those concepts and images in mind, I would like to go back to basics. Urgency Intensive is the name of the event, despite that, we're promoting long-term thinking. How do you, in your practices and in your context of work, balance urgency and long-term thinking?
Would you like to go first, Carolina?
Sure. Well, it is a process, and it all starts definitely, at the beginning of this long-term project. I was looking more at the impacts, and only after learning about the impacts that allowed me to look at the different alternatives and the different pluriverses that are being proposed by the communities on the front lines. And, thinking about energetic transition, which entails not only smaller scale alternative, community-driven, worker-governed grids, electric grids, and systems of power, but also, this transition entails also a dismantling of existing and aging and oppressive infrastructure, or what we call brute force infrastructure, right? So we think about energy transition, an urgent, definitely road and path for us, into the future. But that's going to entail long-term commitments. And I understand that, my Be Damned as a project, long-term project, these are long-term commitments too. It's urgent, but we have to start committing now. And every little gesture builds towards this long-term commitment. So also not feel that what we're doing is not big, quick, strong enough, because then we're falling also into a more corporate way of calculating and thinking, and that's not where we want to go to. But definitely for me, it's to start understanding how can I support this very important step towards a transition that entails the dismantling and the decommissioning of structures such as dams, or in the case of Minas Gerais, where there literally exists a dam terrorism, because we don't know when another dam of this is going to break and kill another 300 people. How can we start pushing this idea that we have to tear down these oppressive brute force infrastructures?
Yeah, well, what I'd say about that, what that brings to mind for me is to think about, going back to you were mentioning, Bruno, that the marshmallow and the acorn, these two parts of kind of who we are in a way. We are partly driven by the short term, but also by the long term, and we have these struggles in our minds. Do I, party today or save for my pensions for tomorrow? Do I upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? But in many ways, there is no contradiction between these things. We can make immediate decisions which have incredibly long-term impacts. So you might decide to have a child, right? And that can be, a decision in the now, but the impacts go on for decades. And in the same way that a government can act with absolute urgency on, the climate crisis, thinking about, making plans for, long-term renewable energy projects, which might have impacts 100 years from now. And I think we need to be working with time in these different kind of ways and not necessarily see there's restrictions between them. I think a really good example is I just noticed in the chat there, someone had asked a question about post-capitalism, and new economic models. And I think there we're seeing a lot of urgent action in people trying to invent new economic models, post-capitalist models, whether it's the B Corporation movement or, for example, the donut economy developed by the British economist Kate Raworth, which is about bringing people above a basic social foundation of economic social rights, but also staying within planetary boundaries, CO2 emissions, ocean acidification, and so on. And we know that even in this moment of COVID crisis, cities like Amsterdam, for example, have adopted that donut model, which is not about growth. It's about thriving in balance and in many ways connecting with the cosmovisions of many indigenous peoples around the world who don't have the central image of their culture being a line going ever upwards like a growth curve. It tends to be something that's much more integrated, a yin and yang, or something, swirling around each other. And these are the kind of economic models that we need to adopt, but we do need to do it with a kind of urgency. We can't just sit back and let our government say, oh, we'll be carbon neutral by 2050. No, there need to be ambitions for now, for tomorrow, to next week, next year, 5 years, and so on. So I think we need to be constantly, dancing and working with time in these ways and embrace that urgency. But let me say one more thing is, there is a conundrum here, yes, which is particularly around economics, which is that we're talking about transforming economies at a speed which has never been done in human history. The shift from feudalism to industrialism took more than 200 years. Now we're talking about trying to have 100% renewable economies in 10 years. Possible? No. But we are transforming our economies faster than at any moment in histories. And I think we've got an enormous amount to learn from indigenous cultures around this too, about reconnecting with land, about ideas of sufficiency, and about ecological stewardship.
Thank you very much. I think now we can open up for questions.
Can I ask
Hicham,
one,
please?
Yeah, a question. Thank you so much, Carolina. Thank you so much, Roman, for your wonderful presentations. And also really loved where you find yourself maybe in the middle of a discussion surrounding urgency, but also long-term thinking. I have a question that I also pose to you, Roman, and you might have thought about it a little bit, is whether we could allow for thinking of erased cultures as part of intergenerational justice. What would that do? And I would have the same question to you, Carolina.
Well, let me say something very briefly about that. Okay. So I think thinking about erased cultures which have been destroyed, languages, peoples, is really important, because we need to think about the legacies we've inherited from the past. So yes, we've inherited positive legacies like medical discoveries that many people benefit from today, not everyone, of course, but also there are those legacies of colonialism and slavery, racism, which are creating those and have created those deep inequities that now must be repaired. And if you want to have a conversation about, for example, reparations, which I think we should be having that conversation in society, then we need to think about erased cultures, or cultures which remain oppressed by colonial structures in many ways, economic and political structures. And we need to, in a sense, recognize that those past cultures had rights, and we need to repair those. We need to think about, okay, are there their descendants? Are there ways of reconnecting with the land that they inhabited? Can we give rights to the living world that they honored and that they cared about. And I think that's part of the legacy that we should be passing on. Almost every culture and every religion and spiritual mode of thought has some idea of a golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Well, let's create an intergenerational version. Let's do unto future generations how we would wish past generations had been done to us. And I certainly don't wish that my own social group and background had been eradicated. You know, I'm from a family of Jews, many of whom were killed in the Holocaust, and there are survivors, at least some. So let's think very hard about that question that you raised there.
Thank you. Carolina, would you mind adding to that?
Here in the United States, you know, maybe in Brazil is where I see also a discussion around land back issues, or demarcación ya, which means literally giving back the land to these indigenous communities who have, you know, we all know here, and probably can agree, that have been the best stewards. And precisely because of processes that Roman described in his presentation, you know, they take care of that place because they're totally connected and they're family members of that place within that place, right? So I think that's definitely a way to pursue, a route to pursue, is to give land back to indigenous communities and to learn of the stewards' efforts. There are many examples across the world of how, you know, they've taken care and how they've maintained those forests, those rivers, those oceans, those mountains alive.
Great, thank you.
And maybe just to start with some of the Zoom questions. I felt like this may be fitting in how the discussion was flowing. So we have a question from Madeline Turner. How can we learn from indigenous communities without enacting an extraction of their knowledge? And maybe that's also to Carolina more.
Well, you know, it's, I think to be checking oneself, you know, constantly about academic extractivism, art extractivism, which means, and I mentioned it before, committing long-term to these relationships that you establish when you do field work, when you develop work in collaboration with a community. So, you know, really taking care and fostering these long-term commitments and long-term relationships, these friendships, and fostering reciprocity too. So not, you know, as artists also, we take images, we film, we take testimonies, we interview people, we, you know, bring or collect objects during field work. And what do we bring back? You know, so be very, you know, I always say that socially engaged budget should have a return ticket written into it, you know, and that's something I really push for. Because once we do the project, we present it outside of the community work with, you know, there is a responsibility of us as artists and as institutions too that foster these kind of works to bring back, to show, to share, to reap the cultural capital, also that, to share that cultural capital that we reap out of these projects back with, you know, really economic resources back into the community. Also some of that capital, cultural capital that we reap, bring it back to the community too. So there's many ways, and we have to check ourselves constantly as artists with our colleagues. And I think the other way is also is, you know, highlighting those voices and that knowledge. So be it more inclusive in our projects, in our seminars, in our, you know, project, you know, events to bring in these voices to the forefront. Enough is enough, you know. They have to be in the forefront now.
So let's go back to the Zoom chat. There are plenty of questions. I'll do this one, Inga. So it's from Matthew Wilson and it's to Roman. It's quite long. I have a question from Roman. As we see the impact of climate change and the impact of anthropogenic environmental degradation in the daily lives of people already today, just look at Texas in last week, or of course the pandemic caused by zoonotic virus, is there a danger in emphasizing the long term rather than the immediate reality we are facing already today? As the marshmallow versus acorn brain, which I think Freud would call the pleasure principle versus reality principle, I think relates, we are not great at long-term thinking. How can we reward short-term thinking in ways that have long-term impacts?
That's a great question. I mean, it's certainly true that we're not as good at long-term thinking as short-term. I mean, if someone throws a rock at your head, we'll instinctively duck out of the way. Now, climate change is also a rock that's been thrown at our head. It's just traveling at a different speed, and we find it harder to duck out of the way. But of course, the impacts of the climate emergency are being felt here and now, whether it's by, particularly in marginalized communities, in low-income countries, floods in Bangladesh, drought in Kenya, but also in Texas, all over the place. So that future is here. It may not be evenly distributed as yet, but it's definitely here. And, I think we need to be engaging in multiple ways and on multiple time scales. I'm not saying that we should only be thinking 100 years from now or only 1,000 years from now. Of course, we need to act with urgency here and now, but, around many issues to do with, coral bleaching, for example. Anyone who's seen the film Chasing Coral, for example, will know that, you once you see coral bleaching happening, even, filmed, certainly for me, I can't let go of that issue. It feels so urgent here and now. It doesn't seem, this is not something about long. But I think one of the, important ways of thinking about this is going back to the idea, you're talking, Carolina, about territory, and not landscape, and to recognize that it's through an embeddedness in place, in whichever ways make sense to us culturally, that we kind of transcend time, both the short and the long. Going back to that idea of, living within the boundaries of taking care of the place that will take care of our offspring. I mean, that's not my phrase, actually. I stole it, talking about cultural appropriation. I stole it from the great biomimicry thinker, Janine Benyus. And if people don't know her work, I really recommend it, Benyus. And, she says, well, let's learn from nature's 3.8 billion years of research and development. Of course, it's using there a slightly technocratic language, but she's very embedded in indigenous culture, indigenous understandings. And we can learn about reconnecting with place, I think, as a way of transcending time. And just something, what just comes back, another thought just comes to my head, which is almost like a question for Carolina, because I can see that sort of big Earth behind you. I mean, I think it's the Earth, or certainly a big planet of some kind. And I love what you were saying about that hacking the view of the drone, and having the drone's eye view replaced by something else. And it reminded me of something I write about in my book, is the idea of the overview effect. When astronauts first saw the Earth from outer space, again, from a hyper-modern object that they were in, but saw its fragility, saw it as one living whole, and I was just wondering how you think about that, seeing the Earth as one, I guess those photographs of one Earth, and how they relate to, I guess, indigenous cosmologies as well, which probably have, are very different in their perspectives.
I think the Earth and the place is what connects us to our ancestors in the past and in the future. So, when you, and this is what indigenous cosmovisions are about too, it connects us across time. And it's that river, the rivers are that golden thread that connects us with our ancestors in the past and our seventh generation in the future. So if we can understand that actually this place is what, allows us to travel in time and to imagine, that better futures, because it's not going to be the same future here in Southern California as for you in Oxford or you in the Netherlands, and also how to localize those futures. For me, the Be Damned project that looks at different case studies, and also look at the particularities of environmental injustice in different locations across the earth, but also understand that there's a major narrative that unfolds since colonial times and continues into neo-colonial, neoliberal strategies of racism and exploitation today. That's important also to see the bigger picture and to be able to trace those flows of capital, which are very difficult to trace actually, because they're experts in hiding, and loopholes and finding loopholes. So, I think it's important also, to imagine the future, to be able to look back, because the past is what we have in front of us, and that's an Andean saying. The past is what we have in front of us. We know it, so we can look at it, and the future is what we have behind. We don't know it, but if we look in the past, and that's also the Sankofa philosophy in African cultures, to look back to enable to move forward. I think that also threads into what we can take of indigenous knowledge, looking back into these ancestral knowledges, how to root them in contemporary, urgency, and then project them. And I think as artists, we have a great tool of imagination, and our creativity also to imagine, a world without carbon fuel economies, for example.
Yeah, I'll take another question from our Zoom conversation. So Matteo, a freelance curator, is asking to Roman, in the seventh generation principle or in the future design and related concepts, is there a way to include animals, plants, geology, climate, nature, without only thinking about the benefit of humans? And I guess how to do it?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because a lot of these practices, particularly when they get translated across cultures, can start being, I guess maybe infected is the wrong word, but they can be, they can become very anthropocentric, for example. And I think there's lots of interesting work, for example, done by Joanna Macy and the deep ecology movement about saying, doing things like intergenerational conversations. There's a Joanna Macy exercise, I think it's called Seventh Generation, where you talk across, someone imagine themselves from 7 generations ahead and someone from the present, and you have paired conversations. But a lot of her work says, don't just imagine the people in the future, imagine being a stone, imagine being a tree. And I've been in her workshops, and it's a challenge, trying to make those empathic connections. I can look out my window where I am now and I can see an ash tree, right? Which I know creates enough air for 4 human beings, enough oxygens for 4 human beings to breathe. So that tree is my external lungs. It is me, but also, I've come out of the Western scientific, method, surrounded by pieces of paper, as you can see here behind me. And it makes it hard to connect with that tree as my external lungs, and I have to work at that. And I think that, when you're doing that future design work that you're going to be doing over the next couple of days, it'll be really interesting to sort of challenge it. Say, how can we try and bring in the voices of the living world, but not the human living world? A lot of cultures have an idea of like a children's fire or a children's chair. So you might have a board meeting, and you leave one chair for future generations, where you can leave a chair for a river, or for a mountain or an ecosystem of some kind, and enable them to speak, if speak is the right word.
Can I add something to that? Definitely, I think, this, as artists or socially engaged artists, to have the tools also of creative platforms to bring together people of different backgrounds, to build these collective bodies, and the holding of that, the raja at the end of that performance that I show is a mechanism to build, even if temporary at that moment, to build up the collective body, and how do we bring into this collective body that it's so important to resist the corporate body, right? How do we bring these non-human entities into this collective body and heal these relationships that have been cut, and severed by damsels of all shapes and figures? And also, these healing processes, and also understand that these kind of ecosystems or sacred places for indigenous communities, if we call it, they're not sacred because of a ritualistic caprice, let's say. Normally sacred places in indigenous traditions, have that importance because they have an ecological importance. They're like the ICU for the ecosystem. That's where humans and non-human entities breed, recover, restore. So how do we heal our relationships with these sacred and environmentally important places, and how we pay attention to them so we allow for this restoration and this recovery that's so needed?
Thank you so much, both of you. I mean, there are still a lot of questions in the chat, which we unfortunately cannot address due to time constraints. Time is indeed a problem. But Inga and I will make sure some of the questions return in our conversations and discussion, future design discussion in the next 2 days. But thank you so much, Roman. Thank you so much, Carolina, for your wonderful contributions. And give the word to Hicham.
Yeah, and I would like to close down this event for today. And it was magnificent to have the IPCC here, to have you, Carolina, here, to have you, Roman, here, and to see all the connections within and the interconnections. And it's absolutely inspiring. And up for tomorrow. It will be an exciting day.
Inga, do you want to add something?
Yeah, really, thank you so much. And we are looking forward very much to, so that everyone joins us tomorrow and the day after tomorrow.